They said a girl who aged out of the system at 18 inherited 40 acres of swamp, and what they discovered there would change a whole town. What they don't tell you is how it feels to be that girl. If you've ever felt like you were on the outside looking in, or if you know what it's like to have to fight for your own story, this is for you. Hit that subscribe button because we're going to get into it, and I want you to be a part of this community. My 18th birthday didn't come with a party or a cake with 18 candles. It came with a cardboard box and a signature line. I sat in a beige office that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, the same office I'd been in a dozen times before. Mrs. Gable, my caseworker for the last 4 years, slid a final form across her particle board desk. Her smile was tired, a practiced, gentle thing that never quite reached her eyes. "And that's it, Ilara. You're officially an adult." The words hung in the air, heavy and thin at the same time. An adult. I owned myself now. The thought should have been liberating, but it felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. For 10 years, since my parents' car went off that icy bridge, my life had been a series of files in a cabinet, a name on a list, a bed in a room that was never really mine. The system, for all its sterile indifference, had been a container. Now, the lid was off. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable." My voice was a stranger's, polite and distant. She pushed the box toward me. It contained the sum of my life, a few worn paperbacks, a framed photo of 2 smiling people I barely remembered, a change of clothes, and a bundle of official documents that proved I existed. Birth certificate, social security card. The building blocks of a person I was supposed to start being. "There's a check for the final stipend," she said, pointing to an envelope taped to the box lid. "It's not much, but it'll cover a deposit and first month's rent if you're careful. The resources we talked about are in the folder." I nodded, my throat tight. The resources. Lists of shelters, job placement programs, low-income housing that had waiting lists years long. A map to a world I wasn't sure I was equipped to navigate. I thought of the small room I'd rented in a house with 4 other people, a place I'd found through a frantic online search. It was a start. It had to be. The silence stretched. I could feel her wanting to say something more, something meaningful, but the institutional script had run out of lines. We were at the end of the procedure. "Good luck, Ilara," she said finally, her professional mask cracking for just a second. A flicker of genuine worry crossed her face. "You're a survivor. You'll be okay." A survivor. That's what they called kids like me. It never felt like a compliment. It just felt like a description of a fact. I had survived. The how and the why of it were messier. I stood, my hand resting on the flimsy cardboard. It was lighter than it should have been. It felt like it should have been heavier. For 18 years. I walked out of that building and didn't look back. The city air hit me, thick with exhaust fumes and the smell of hot pavement. I was free. I was terrified. The 2 feelings were so tangled up I couldn't tell them apart. I clutched the box to my chest and started walking toward a bus stop, my new life a formless, frightening fog in front of me. I had $187 in my pocket, a temporary room waiting for me, and a profound, bone-deep loneliness that had been my only constant companion. That was the day I aged out. It was also, though I didn't know it yet, the day my real story began. The call came 3 days later. I was in my new room, a space barely bigger than a closet, with a window that looked out onto a brick wall, trying to make a pot of instant noodles on a hot plate that kept shorting out. The number was unlisted. I almost ignored it. "Hello? Am I speaking with Miss Ilara Vance?" The voice was male, old, and dry as dust. It sounded like money, like mahogany desks and leather-bound books. "This is she," I said, cautious. "Bill collectors had a way of finding you, even when you had nothing. My name is Arthur Abernathy. I am an attorney. I was the legal representative for your maternal grandmother, Maeve O'Connell. The name landed like a stone in a still pond. Maeve O'Connell, my grandmother. A woman who was more of a ghost than a memory. I'd met her once, a fleeting visit when I was 5 or 6. I remembered a tall, severe woman with hands stained with dirt and a scent of rain and damp earth clinging to her clothes. My parents had argued with her. We'd left in a hurry. After that, she was just a name. A Christmas card with a crisp $20 bill that stopped coming after the accident. I'd been told she passed away over a year ago, a fact delivered to me by a previous social worker as a clinical footnote in my family history. Okay, I said, not sure what else to say. Miss O'Connell's estate has finally cleared probate, Mr. Abernathy continued, his tone unchanging. She named you as her sole beneficiary. I need to schedule a meeting with you to finalize the transfer of assets. Assets. The word sounded absurd. My grandmother, from what I recalled, lived in a shack in the middle of nowhere. I pictured inheriting a chipped tea set or a box of old photographs. I don't understand, I said. Assets? What assets? It would be better to discuss this in person. My office is downtown. Would tomorrow at 10 be acceptable? I agreed, a nod of confusion and a faint, ridiculous flicker of hope tightening in my stomach. The next morning, I put on the nicest shirt I owned, a faded blue button-down, and took 2 buses to a part of the city I'd only ever seen in movies. Abernathy's office was in a tall glass building with a lobby so quiet you could hear the soft whir of the elevators. His office was on the 32nd floor. The view was dizzying, the entire city spread out like a map. Mr. Abernathy was exactly as his voice had suggested. He was a small, neat man in a perfectly tailored gray suit, with thin white hair and eyes that seemed to assess everything with calm, dispassionate logic. His office smelled of old paper and lemon polish. He didn't shake my hand, but gestured for me to sit in a plush leather chair that hissed as I sank into it. Thank you for coming, Miss Vance, he began, opening a thick file on his desk. Let's get straight to it. Your grandmother's will is quite simple. She left you everything she owned. He paused, letting that sink in. I waited. Her primary asset, he said, sliding a document across the desk, is a parcel of land, 40 acres to be precise, located in a rural, unincorporated area known as Cypress Hollow. He let me read the deed. The legal language was dense, but the description was clear. 40 acres of undeveloped wetland. I looked up at him. Wetland? You mean a swamp? That is a fair assessment, he said, with no hint of humor. The property includes a small cabin, but by all accounts, it is in a state of significant disrepair. The land itself has very little agricultural or residential value. The flicker of hope in my stomach died, replaced by a familiar, dull disappointment. A swamp. Of course. It felt like a cosmic punchline. The orphan girl gets an inheritance, and it's 40 acres of mud and mosquitoes. I could feel a bitter laugh bubbling up inside me. However, Mr. Abernathy said, cutting through my thoughts, there is a complication. Or perhaps an opportunity. He pulled another piece of paper from the file. It was a letter on expensive letterhead. I've been contacted by a corporation, Clearwater Properties. They are a land development firm with interests in that region. They are aware that the estate has cleared probate, and they have made an offer to purchase the property from you. He slid the offer letter over. My eyes scanned for the number. When I found it, my breath caught. $50,000, I whispered. To Mr. Abernathy, it was probably a pittance. To me, it was a fortune. It was a new life. It was the ability to walk into an apartment leasing office and not have them laugh at my bank balance. It was a college course. It was a reliable car. It was security. something I hadn't felt in a decade. They state in their letter that they wish to acquire the land for ecological mitigation purposes, Abernathy explained. Essentially, they need to preserve a certain amount of wetland to offset development elsewhere. Your grandmother's property is adjacent to other parcels they are acquiring. The offer is, in my professional opinion, quite fair for land of that type. It's a straightforward transaction. You sign the papers, and the money is wired to an account for you within the week. A clean break. A clean break. The words echoed the ones Mrs. Gable had used for my emancipation. It sounded so simple, so sensible. Take the money. Run. Don't look back. It was the smart thing to do. Any sane person would sign the paper without a second thought. I picked up the pen he offered me. The plastic was cool and smooth against my fingers. $50,000. I could taste the freedom. But my hand hesitated. A memory, thin as cobwebs, surfaced in my mind. Me, a little girl, holding my grandmother's hand. Her fingers were rough, calloused, but her grip was firm. We were standing at the edge of a marshy patch of ground, watching a turtle slide into dark water. Everything has a purpose, Ilara, her voice had said, a low rumble. Even the things people throw away. It was nothing, a fragment of a half-forgotten afternoon, but it was there. I want to see it first, I said. The words came out before I had even consciously decided to say them. Mr. Abernathy raised a single, skeptical eyebrow. See it. Miss Vance, with all due respect, it's a 6-hour bus ride from here, followed by a taxi to a location that barely exists on a map. There is nothing there but mud, insects, and decaying timber. The offer is on the table now. These things can be rescinded. I understand, I said, my own resolve surprising me. But she left it to me. I have to see it. Before I sell it, I have to stand on it, just once. He stared at me for a long moment, his logical, ordered world briefly disrupted by this entirely illogical request. Finally, he gave a small, defeated sigh. He pushed a business card across the desk. Very well. When you've had your fill of the rustic life, call me, and I will courier the documents to you for your signature. He made it sound like an inevitability, a temporary delay of the foregone conclusion. Maybe he was right. But as I walked out of his office, the offer letter folded in my pocket, I felt a strange sense of purpose. I wasn't just running away from my past anymore. For the first time, I felt like I might be running toward something. The bus station was a chaotic swirl of arrivals and departures, people running toward reunions and away from goodbyes. I bought a one-way ticket to a town called Oakhaven, the closest stop to Cypress Hollow. One way. I told myself it was because I wasn't sure when I'd be coming back. But a deeper, more honest part of me knew it was because I was severing another tie. The little room with the view of a brick wall already felt like it belonged to another lifetime. The bus pulled out of the city under a gray, overcast sky. I watched the skyscrapers shrink in the window, replaced by an endless sprawl of suburbs, then strip malls, then fields. The landscape flattened out, the colors fading from concrete gray to the dusty brown of late autumn farmland. The other passengers were a quiet, weary collection of souls. A young mother trying to hush a fussy baby, an old man staring blankly out the window, a group of migrant workers speaking softly in Spanish. We were all in transit, suspended between where we'd been and where we were going. I spent most of the ride with my forehead pressed against the cool glass, letting the monotonous scenery blur past. I thought about the $50,000. I planned it out in my head, a fantasy budget for a life I didn't have. A small, clean apartment, a used car that actually ran, community college classes, maybe starting with an English course. I'd always liked to read. The money felt like a key that could unlock a door to a normal life. A life where you didn't have to count every dollar for a loaf of bread, where you didn't feel the constant, low-grade hum of anxiety about where you would sleep next month. And yet, underneath the practical fantasy, the question lingered. Why a swamp? Why leave me that, of all things? My grandmother could have sold it herself and left me the money. It would have been simpler, cleaner. Leaving me the land itself felt intentional, like a message I was supposed to decipher. Or maybe I was just a girl raised on stories, trying to find meaning where there was none. Maybe it was just a final, eccentric act of a woman I never knew. Hours bled into one another. The sun finally broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the fields. The bus began to make more frequent stops in smaller and smaller towns, places with a single blinking traffic light and a handful of storefronts. The air coming through the vents started to smell different, less of exhaust and more of damp earth, of pine and something vaguely floral and decaying. We were getting close. The bus driver called out, "Oakhaven. Next stop, Oakhaven." I gathered my small backpack and the cardboard box, which felt more cumbersome and pathetic than ever. I was the only one who got off. The bus hissed away, leaving me in a profound quiet. The town consisted of a short main street with a post office, a diner with a buzzing neon sign, a hardware store, and a general store with a faded Coca-Cola sign painted on its brick side. A dog barked in the distance. That was it. I walked into the general store. The bell above the door chimed. An old woman with a cloud of white hair sat behind the counter, reading a newspaper. She looked up at me over her glasses, her gaze taking in my city clothes and my out-of-place box. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy. "I'm looking for a taxi. I need to get to a place called Cypress Hollow." A flicker of something, curiosity, pity, crossed her face. "Cypress Hollow ain't much of a place, honey. And there ain't no taxis out here. Closest you'll get is Earl, if his truck is running. He hauls things for folks sometimes." She made a call on an old rotary phone, her conversation short and muffled. "He'll be here in 20 minutes, she said, hanging up. "He can take you as far as the old logging road. The rest of the way you'll have to walk." "Thank you," I said, feeling more and more like a fool. What was I doing here? I bought a bottle of water and a bag of peanuts, the reality of my impulsive trip starting to set in. A rusty blue pickup truck, louder than a freight train, soon rattled to a stop outside. The man who called himself Earl was leathery and thin, with a face mapped by years under the sun. He barely glanced at me, just grunted and threw my box in the truck bed. "Cypress Hollow," he said, more to himself than to me, as we drove out of town. "Ain't been nobody out that way since old Maeve O'Connell passed. You family?" "Her granddaughter," I said quietly. He glanced at me then, a quick, sharp look. "Huh, she never mentioned no family." He shrugged and turned his attention back to the road. "Well, the place is yours now, I guess. Hope you like snakes." He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. The paved road gave way to gravel, and the gravel road eventually dissolved into a 2-track dirt path overgrown with weeds. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangling overhead, plunging the road into a perpetual twilight. The air grew thick and humid, heavy with the smell of wet dirt and vegetation. Earl stopped the truck where the path became impassable, a mess of deep, muddy ruts. "This is as far as I go," he said, pointing. "Follow that track about a half-mile. You'll see the gate. Can't miss it." He helped me get my box out of the back. As I stood there in the mud, holding all my worldly possessions, he hesitated for a second. "Listen," he said, his tone softening slightly. "Maeve was different, kept to herself, but she wasn't a bad sort. This land, she loved it, for what it's worth." He tipped his hat, climbed back into his truck, and rattled away, leaving me alone with the buzzing of insects and the oppressive silence of the swamp. I was finally here. I stood for a long time at the edge of the muddy track, the silence pressing in. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of a different kind of sound. The drone of a million insects, the distant croak of a frog, the rustle of something unseen in the undergrowth. The air was a physical presence, thick and wet, clinging to my skin. I hoisted the cardboard box higher on my hip and started walking. The path was worse than it looked. My sneakers, meant for city pavement, sank into the mud. Within minutes, my jeans were splattered to the knees. The half-mile felt like 5. Finally, through a thicket of tangled vines, I saw it. A rusted iron gate hanging crookedly from a single hinge. A weathered wooden sign nailed to a post had long since rotted into illegibility. This was it, the entrance to my inheritance. Pushing through the gate, I found the land was even wilder inside. The track was barely visible, a faint suggestion of a path snaking through a dense forest of cypress, tupelo, and oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The ground was a spongy carpet of damp leaves and roots that seemed deliberately placed to trip me. Sunlight struggled to pierce the canopy, dappling the ground in shifting patterns of light and deep shadow. It felt ancient, primeval, untouched. And then I saw the cabin. It was small, smaller than I'd imagined, nestled in a small clearing. It was made of dark, weathered wood, with a tin roof stained rust red. A stone chimney stood sentry on one side, and a wide porch sagged in the middle like it was tired of holding itself up. It wasn't a ruin, not quite. It was still standing, defiant against the encroaching wilderness. It looked impossibly lonely. I set my box down on the porch steps, the wood groaning under the minimal weight. The front door was unlocked. It swung inward with a long, low creak, opening into a single, large room. The air inside was cool and musty, thick with the smell of dust, dry rot, and time. What little light came through the grimy windows illuminated a scene frozen in amber. Most of the furniture, a simple wooden table, 2 chairs, a lumpy-looking armchair, was draped in white dust cloths, making them look like pale ghosts in the gloom. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, its hearth black with old soot. To the right was a small, partitioned-off kitchen area with a hand-pump sink and a wood-burning stove. A ladder led up to a sleeping loft. It was a time capsule. It felt like my grandmother had just stepped out for a moment, and a year had passed by mistake. I ran a finger along the dusty mantelpiece, leaving a clean streak. This was her home. The place she had chosen over her family, over me. A pang of resentment, sharp and unexpected, went through me. What kind of person would choose this isolation? I started exploring, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I pulled a sheet off the armchair. The fabric underneath was faded but intact. I sat down, and a puff of dust exploded around me. This was crazy. I should have taken the money. What could I possibly find here besides spiders and sadness? My eyes scanned the room, looking for something, anything that might offer a clue. A journal, a letter, a photograph. But the cabin was Spartan, almost monastic. There were no personal trinkets, no clutter. Just the bare essentials of a solitary life. On the mantelpiece, next to where my finger had traced a line in the dust, sat a small, heavy object. It was a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, painted black. It was locked with a small, sturdy-looking padlock. I picked it up. It was heavy. I shook it, but whatever was inside was packed tight and didn't rattle. A locked box. It was a cliché, something out of a children's adventure story, but there it was. My heart started beating a little faster. Where was the key? I spent the next hour searching the cabin. I checked every drawer in the small kitchen, finding only a few rusty utensils and some empty mason jars. I looked in the pockets of an old canvas coat hanging on a peg by the door. Nothing but a dried leaf and a button. I climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft. A simple cot with a neatly folded wool blanket sat under the eaves. A small crate served as a nightstand. Inside it, I found a half-burned candle and a book of matches. No key. I was starting to feel frustrated, the initial spark of excitement fading. Maybe the box was just an old cash box she'd lost the key to years ago. Maybe it was empty. I sat on the edge of the cot, the dusty air making my throat feel tight. I was about to give up, to go back outside and find a spot with a cell signal to call Abernathy and tell him to draw up the papers. As I stood up, my foot scuffed against a loose floorboard. It was barely noticeable, a slight give that the others didn't have. I knelt down. The board was shorter than the others, its end not quite flush with the wall. Using my fingernails, I managed to pry it up. It came away with a small groan of protest. And there, nestled in the dark, dusty space between the floor joists, was the key. It wasn't a small padlock key. It was an old, ornate skeleton key, the kind you see for antique furniture. It didn't fit the padlock on the box. I felt a fresh wave of disappointment, but as my fingers closed around it, I saw something else lying beside it. A small, simple brass key, tarnished with age. It looked like it would fit the padlock perfectly. Why were there two keys? I pocketed them both, my hands trembling slightly. I went back down the ladder, my heart thumping against my ribs. The black metal box was waiting for me on the table, a silent challenge. The small brass key slid into the padlock. It was stiff at first, and I had to jiggle it, my frustration mounting. I was sure I was going to snap it off in the lock. I took a deep breath, blew the dust out of the keyhole, and tried again, turning it slowly, gently. There was a faint click. So quiet, I almost missed it. The lock sprang open. My hands were shaking as I lifted the lid of the box. I half expected to see jewelry, or old coins, or some other conventional treasure. But it wasn't that. The box was filled almost to the brim with letters, bundled in stacks and tied with faded twine. On top of the letters sat two objects. One was a tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. The other was a single, heavy, rust-pitted iron key, large and archaic-looking. It looked like it belonged to a medieval dungeon, not a cabin in a swamp. I picked up the locket first. It was cool and heavy in my palm. With my thumbnail, I managed to pry it open. On one side was a tiny, faded photograph of my mother. She looked so young, younger than I'd ever seen her, her smile bright and unguarded. On the other side was a picture of a man I assumed was my father, and in the space between them, a third photo had been expertly fitted in, a tiny portrait of a baby with a tuft of dark hair. Me. My grandmother had carried a picture of all of us. The thought sent a confusing ache through my chest. This wasn't the act of a woman who didn't care. I set the locket aside and picked up the topmost bundle of letters. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the edges. A single envelope on top was addressed simply to Ilara. The handwriting was elegant, but the lines wavered slightly, as if written by a hand that was fighting a tremor. I slid my finger under the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "My dearest Ilara," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has finally turned you loose. I am sorry. I am sorry for so many things. For the silence. For the distance. For not being the grandmother you deserved. I hope one day you will understand that my silence was not born of indifference, but of a terrible, necessary love." I had to stop and take a breath, my eyes blurring. The formal, almost poetic language felt so at odds with the rustic simplicity of the cabin. "I have left you this land," the letter continued. "I know what they will say about it. They will call it worthless. They will tell you to sell it, to take the money and run. Perhaps that is the sensible thing to do. But I am asking you not to be sensible, not yet. This land is not a property, it is a guardian. It has been my sanctuary, and it has kept my secrets. More importantly, it has kept you safe. I had to make a choice a long time ago, a choice that cost me my son and you. I chose to become a ghost in your life so that you could have a life at all. The reasons are buried here with me. The truth is not in what you see, but in what you are willing to look for. The hearth holds more than just warmth. The rest of the story is for you to uncover, if you choose to. The choice, like the land, is now yours. Whatever you decide, know this: you were never forgotten. You were always loved. Your grandmother, Maeve. I read the letter 3 times, the words swimming in front of me. Safe? Kept me safe from what? What choice? The letter was a tapestry of riddles, offering a sliver of emotional connection while deepening the mystery. It raised 1,000 questions for every one it answered. I looked around the dusty, silent cabin. It no longer felt empty. It felt watchful. The hearth holds more than just warmth. My eyes went to the big stone fireplace, cold and dark against the far wall. Suddenly, my phone, which I'd thought had no service, buzzed in my pocket, a jarring electronic intrusion. I fumbled for it, my hands still unsteady. The screen read, Arthur Abernathy. I swiped to answer. Miss Vance, he said, his voice crisp and immediate. I'm glad I reached you. I have news. What is it? I asked, my voice hoarse. Clearwater Properties has been in touch again. They are very eager to close this deal. They've amended their offer. He paused for dramatic effect. They are now offering $125,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $125,000. It was an astronomical sum, an impossible, life-altering amount of money. It was more than a fresh start. It was a whole new world. There is a condition, however, Abernathy continued, his tone cautious. The new offer is final, and it expires in 48 hours. They want an answer by the end of the day tomorrow. They are putting on the pressure, Miss Vance. They want this land. I sank into the dusty armchair, Maeve's letter clutched in one hand, my phone in the other. $125,000. All I had to do was say yes. I could walk away from this confusing, mosquito-infested place, from the ghosts and the riddles and the dirt. I could buy a real life, a clean one, with no complicated past attached. I could forget all about Maeve O'Connell and her cryptic apologies. It was the logical choice, the sane choice. But I looked at the letter, at the words, kept you safe. I looked at the cold, dark maw of the fireplace. The hearth holds more than just warmth, a choice. My grandmother had faced a terrible choice. And now, it seemed, so did I. The easy money or the hard truth. I'm going to pause the story for a second here and just talk to you. Have you ever been at a crossroads like that? A moment where your head is screaming at you to do the sensible thing, to take the easy way out, but your heart, your gut, is pulling you in a completely different direction. A choice between a comfortable lie and a difficult truth. It's a moment that defines who you are. If you've ever had a moment like that, or if this is resonating with you, let me know in the comments below. I read them all, and I think it's important we share these stories. It makes us all feel a little less alone. Now, let's get back to that cabin, with the deadline ticking. The silence in the cabin was a living thing after Abernathy's call. The new offer hung in the air, a shimmering, seductive promise. I could feel its pull, a gravitational force trying to wrench me back to the world of logic and reason. $125,000. I could be on a bus back to the city by morning. I could leave the dust and the mystery behind me. But Maeve's words had taken root, kept you safe. I chose to become a ghost in your life so you could have a life at all. It wasn't the rambling of an eccentric old woman. It was a declaration, a confession. I looked from the letter in my hand to the cold, black fireplace. The hearth holds more than just warmth. It was a direct instruction, a clue left for me and only me. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Not anymore. I couldn't take the money and live the rest of my life wondering what secret my grandmother had died to protect. I couldn't live with the ghost of her sacrifice haunting me. I had to know. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. I found an old oil lamp and, after a few tries, got it to light, pushing back the gloom with a warm, flickering glow. In a shed out back, among rusted gardening tools and stacks of firewood, I found a bucket and a small trowel. The work was going to be filthy. As dusk settled over the swamp, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, I knelt before the fireplace. It was huge, built from large, irregular river stones mortared together. The firebox was deep, big enough to sit inside, and coated with a thick layer of soot and ash that probably went back decades. I started with the trowel, scooping the cold, gray ash into the bucket. It was fine as powder and smelled faintly of charcoal and rain. A cloud of it billowed up, coating my face and clothes, making me cough. It was slow, tedious work. Bucketful after bucketful of ash came out of the hearth. I lost track of time, focused only on the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone. My arms began to ache. The lamp cast my shadow, large and distorted, on the wall behind me. The cabin felt impossibly quiet, the only sounds my own breathing and the scraping of the trowel. Finally, I hit the stone floor of the firebox. I had cleared out all the loose debris. I ran my hands over the stones, feeling for anything unusual. They were all solid, cold, and firmly mortared in place. My heart sank. Had I misunderstood? Was it just a metaphor? I sat back on my heels, covered in grime, feeling a fresh wave of foolishness wash over me. Of course there was nothing here. I was a girl playing detective in a fantasy of her own making. But then my eyes caught something. I had been focused on the floor of the hearth. But Maeve's clue wasn't about the floor. The hearth. The entire structure. I brought the lamp closer, examining the back wall of the firebox. It was a solid wall of blackened stone. But near the bottom, in the right-hand corner, one stone seemed different. It was flatter than the others, more rectangular, and the mortar line around it looked thinner, less substantial. I pushed at it with my fingers. It didn't budge. I used the handle of the trowel to tap along its edges. The sound was slightly different, more hollow than the stones around it. Hope, sharp and sudden, surged through me. I wedged the tip of the trowel into the thin mortar line and pried. The old mortar crumbled, falling away in a shower of grit. I worked my fingers into the gap and pulled. The stone moved. It scraped backward with a grating sound, heavy and reluctant. I pulled it all the way out and set it on the floor. Behind it was a dark, rectangular cavity, just big enough to fit a small parcel. My breath caught in my throat. Reaching into the darkness, my fingers brushed against oilcloth. I pulled it out. It was a bundle, tightly wrapped and tied with string. It was heavy. I carried it over to the table and, with trembling hands, unwrapped it. Inside were two items. The first was another series of letters, older than the first, the paper even more yellowed. The second was a hand-drawn map, sketched on a piece of heavy canvas. It was a detailed drawing of the 40 acres. It showed the creek that ran through it, the boundaries, and the location of the cabin. But it also showed things I hadn't seen. Faint trails, specific clearings, and several trees marked with symbols. One tree, a massive cypress on the western edge of the property, was circled in red ink. Next to it, Maeve had written a single word: Sentinel. I picked up the new letter that was sitting on top of the pile. It was addressed to me, just like the other one. Ilara, it read. If you found this, it means you have my stubbornness. Good, you will need it. The map is your guide. The sentinel is your destination. What you are looking for is buried at its roots. Go at dawn. The morning light slants through the canopy in a way that will illuminate the spot. You cannot miss it. Be careful. The ground is treacherous, but the real danger is not in the swamp. The real danger is in the truth you are about to unearth. This is your last chance to turn back. No one would blame you for taking the money and leaving this place to be swallowed by time. But if you go forward, you must go all the way. The fight I started will become yours. My phone buzzed again. It was a text from Abernathy. Clearwater called again.
They want to know if you've considered their offer.
I stared at the map, at the red circle, at the word sentinel. A fight. She had been in a fight. I thought of the $125,000. It wasn't an offer. It was a bribe. They weren't trying to buy a worthless piece of swamp. They were trying to buy my silence. I typed out a reply to Abernathy. My fingers were steady. Tell them no. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. A moment later, he replied with a single character. Question mark? I wrote back. I'm not selling. Not now. Not ever. I'll call you when I know more. I turned off my phone, cutting the last tie to that other world. The decision was made. There was no turning back now. I was going all the way. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the armchair, the oil lamp flickering, and read Maeve's other letters, the ones I'd found in the fireplace.
They weren't a continuous story, but a collection of journal entries dated over a span of nearly 20 years. They were a chronicle of her life here, her observations of the land, the flora, the fauna. She wrote about the swamp with a scientist's precision and a poet's love. She described the nesting patterns of herons, the life cycle of rare orchids that only grew in the deep marsh, the way the water levels changed with the seasons. This wasn't just a place she lived, it was a place she knew intimately. But woven between the peaceful observations of nature was a thread of growing darkness. It started subtly. An entry from 15 years ago mentioned a strange, chemical smell on the air after a heavy rain. Another, a year later, noted that the fish in the creek seemed sluggish, some floating belly up. Then came the discovery of discolored soil and sick-looking trees on the property line bordering a vast, unused tract of land owned by a holding company. Maeve began to investigate. Her entries turned into a log of a clandestine inquiry. She took soil and water samples, sending them to a trusted friend at a university lab under a different name. The results, she wrote, were horrifying. The samples were laced with a cocktail of industrial solvents and heavy metals, toxins of the worst kind. The holding company, she discovered after months of digging through public records, was a subsidiary of a much larger corporation, Clearwater Properties. They had been using the adjacent, supposedly empty land for years as an illegal dumping ground for their chemical waste. It was cheap, it was remote, and no one was there to notice. Except for her. The last few entries were tense and frightened. She had confronted them, armed with her data. She had written to the EPA, to state regulators. But Clearwater's lawyers had stonewalled her. They threatened her with lawsuits, accusing her of slander, of trespassing. Then the threats had become more personal. A dead animal left on her porch. The brake lines on her old truck cut. They were trying to scare her into silence. The final entry was dated just after my parents' accident. It was short, the handwriting almost illegible with grief and rage. They know about my son. They mentioned him. They know about the baby. I cannot put them in the path of this monster. The only way to protect them is to cut them out. They must believe I want nothing to do with them. It will break my heart, but it will keep theirs beating. From this day on, I fight alone. I finally understood. Her coldness, her distance, it was a shield. She had built a wall around her family and stood on the other side of it, facing the dragon alone. My abandonment wasn't an abandonment at all. It was the most painful, selfless act of protection I could imagine. I sat there in the dark, tears streaming down my face, mourning for the grandmother I never got to know,
and for the sacrifice I never understood until now.
As the first hint of gray light appeared in the windows, I wiped my eyes, folded the letters, and stood up. My grief had solidified into something hard and clear: resolve. This wasn't just about uncovering a secret anymore. This was about justice. For Maeve. I pulled on the old canvas coat from the peg by the door and a pair of sturdy-looking boots I'd found in the shed. I put the map, a compass I'd found with it, a bottle of water, and the heavy iron key from the first box into my backpack. Then, as the sun began to rise, I stepped out into the misty morning and followed the map toward the Sentinel. The swamp was a different world at dawn. A thick white mist coiled around the tree trunks and hovered over the dark, still water, muffling all sound. The air was cool and clean. Following the map wasn't easy. The trails Maeve had marked were faint, almost reclaimed by the wilderness. I had to push through thickets of saw palmetto and navigate around pools of stagnant water that were deeper than they looked. My face and arms were scratched by thorns, my boots soaked with mud. But Maeve's map was accurate. Every landmark, a lightning-scarred oak, a cluster of oddly shaped boulders, a sharp bend in the creek, was exactly where she'd drawn it. She knew this land like the back of her hand. After nearly an hour of trekking, I saw it. It rose out of the mist like a cathedral, the Sentinel. It was a cypress tree of immense size, far larger than any of the others. Its base was a gnarled fortress of roots, as wide as a small car, and its trunk soared upward, disappearing into the canopy. It felt ancient, sacred. Just as Maeve's letter had promised, the rising sun now slanted through a gap in the trees, sending a single, golden shaft of light directly onto the base of the Sentinel. And in that patch of light, at the foot of the massive tree, I saw it. A patch of moss, greener and thicker than the rest, growing in a suspiciously perfect rectangle. I knelt down and pulled the moss away. It came off like a blanket, revealing not the dark earth I expected, but a flat, gray stone. It was about 2 feet square, clearly man-made, its edges too smooth to be natural. This had to be it. In the shed, I had had the foresight to grab a small shovel and a heavy iron pry bar. I wedged the tip of the pry bar into the seam between the stone and the surrounding dirt and put all my weight on it. At first, nothing happened. The stone was seated deep. I repositioned the bar, found better leverage, and tried again, grunting with the effort. Slowly, with a deep sucking sound, the stone lifted. I heaved it over onto its side. It revealed a dark opening, and set into the opening was a round, rusted metal hatch with a heavy iron ring for a handle. In the center of the hatch was a keyhole, large and old, matching the strange iron key from the box. My heart hammered in my chest. I took the key from my backpack. It slid into the lock with a satisfying metallic thud. Using both hands, I turned it. There was a loud, grinding clank from within the mechanism, and the hatch moved slightly. I grabbed the iron ring and pulled. The hatch was incredibly heavy, but it lifted on a hidden, counterweighted hinge, opening with a groan of protest. It revealed a ladder leading down into darkness. A waft of cool, dry, earthy air rose to meet me. It didn't smell foul or stagnant. It smelled like a cellar. Taking a deep breath, my flashlight from the shed in hand, I swung my legs over the edge and began to climb down into the earth. The ladder was solid, bolted to a concrete wall. It descended about 15 feet into a space that was much larger than I expected. I clicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp white cone through the absolute blackness. The space was a room, roughly 10 by 15 feet, with a concrete floor and walls. It was a bunker, a hidden underground study. Against one wall was a simple desk and chair. On the desk sat a manual typewriter and a stack of blank paper. Against the other walls were shelves, and on the shelves were dozens of labeled binders and sample jars. But dominating the center of the room were 3 large, military-style footlockers sealed shut. My light fell on a note taped to the lid of the first footlocker. It was in Maeve's handwriting. Ilara, this is your war chest. Use it to hire the best. Do not let them crush you like they tried to crush me. Justice is expensive. My hands trembled as I undid the latches. I lifted the heavy lid. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The footlocker was filled, packed tight, with cash. Bundles of $100 bills neatly wrapped in paper bands. It wasn't 50,000 or 100,000. It looked like much, much more. It was the proceeds of a lifetime of quiet saving, a secret war fund accumulated over decades. I was stunned, but I forced myself to move on. The money was a tool, not the prize. The real treasure, the real weapon, was in the other lockers. I opened the second one. This one was filled with the binders from the shelves. I opened one. It was a meticulously organized collection of evidence. There were the original lab reports on the soil and water samples, with horrifying levels of toxicity. There were copies of Clearwater's internal documents, obtained, according to Maeve's notes, from a sympathetic whistleblower who had later been fired. There were sworn affidavits from other locals who had been threatened. There were photographs, maps charting the spread of the contamination plume, and a detailed timeline of Clearwater's criminal dumping activities. It was a complete and damning indictment, a prosecutor's dream case. Then I opened the third and final footlocker. It wasn't filled with documents, it was filled with Maeve's life, her personal journals, going all the way back to her college days. Photographs of her as a young, ambitious scientist, pictures of her with my mother as a little girl, a box of the letters my father had sent her before their falling out, filled with love and admiration, and at the very bottom, a small, worn teddy bear. A note attached to it read, "The one you left behind when you were 5. I kept it safe for you." I sank to the floor, clutching the bear to my chest, and I wept. I cried for the years we had lost. I cried for the woman who had given up everything to be a silent guardian. I cried for the baby in the locket who never got to know this fierce, brilliant, loving woman. I sat there in the dark, underground room, surrounded by the evidence of her fight and the proof of her love, and the last of my fear and doubt was washed away in a flood of grief and white-hot anger. The fight was mine now, and I was going to win it for her. I stayed in the bunker for hours, piecing together the full, ugly story from Maeve's meticulous records. The scale of Clearwater's crime was staggering. For over a decade, they had treated this remote corner of the world as their private landfill, poisoning the groundwater that fed not only Maeve's 40 acres, but the entire region, including the town of Oakhaven. They had systematically covered it up, intimidating locals, firing whistleblowers, and using their army of lawyers to bury any inquiry in paperwork. Maeve was the only one who had never backed down. The war chest was her final, brilliant move. She had lived a life of extreme frugality, saving every penny, investing wisely, all to build a fund for a fight she knew she might not live to see. The total was just over $500,000. It was a staggering amount, a testament to her decades of quiet, focused sacrifice. Sitting there on the concrete floor, the enormity of what she had left me settled in. It wasn't a swamp. It wasn't money. It was a legacy, a responsibility, a weapon. When I finally climbed out of the bunker, the afternoon sun was slanting low through the trees. The world looked different. The swamp no longer seemed menacing or worthless. It seemed sacred. A victim, just like my grandmother. A place worth fighting for. I made my way back to the cabin, my steps certain and sure. I knew exactly what I had to do. I turned my phone back on. The first call I made wasn't to the press or the EPA. It was to Arthur Abernathy. He picked up on the first ring. "Miss Vance, I've been trying to reach you. Clearwater is rescinding their offer. They said if you won't deal, they'll find other ways." It sounded like a threat. "It was," I said, my voice calm and cold. "Mr. Abernathy, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not selling the land.
I am going to sue Clearwater Properties into the ground. And my grandmother left me the ammunition to do it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could picture him in his pristine office, completely bewildered. I spent the next 30 minutes laying it all out for him. The bunker, the documents, the lab reports, the money. I told him everything. When I finished, the silence stretched again. Then he spoke, and his voice was different. The dry, dispassionate lawyer was gone. In his place was a man who sounded shocked, angry, and deeply impressed.
"My God," he whispered. "Maeve. She actually did it. The stubborn old woman. She actually did it." "You knew?" I asked. "I knew she was fighting them," he admitted. "She tried to hire me years ago, but I told her it was hopeless. They were too big, too powerful. I told her to sell, to walk away. She fired me, called me a coward, and said she'd do it herself. I never imagined this." He cleared his throat. "Miss Vance, Ilara, what Maeve O'Connell did was heroic. It would be the greatest honor of my career to help you finish this fight. I'm on the next flight out." That was the beginning. Abernathy was true to his word. With Maeve's war chest, we didn't just hire a good legal team. We hired the best environmental litigation firm in the country. We didn't just file a lawsuit. We launched an all-out assault. We used Maeve's evidence to get the EPA to launch a federal investigation.
We reached out to the whistleblower, who, now protected and backed by our resources, agreed to testify. The story exploded. "The Swamp Girls' War," one headline called it. The narrative was irresistible. The orphaned girl, the faceless corporation, the secret legacy of a brilliant, reclusive grandmother. Clearwater's stock plummeted. Their executives were subpoenaed. The fight was brutal and ugly. They tried to paint me as a greedy opportunist. They tried to discredit Maeve as an unstable eccentric. But her evidence was too meticulous, too damning. The truth, once unearthed, had a power all its own. The legal battle raged for nearly 2 years. I didn't go back to the city. I stayed in Maeve's cabin. I used some of the money to make it habitable, patched the roof, got a small generator for electricity, installed a satellite dish for internet. I learned to live on the land, to understand its rhythms. I saw the herons Maeve wrote about. I found her rare orchids. The swamp became my home. In the end, we won. Clearwater was found guilty of massive, systemic environmental crimes. They were hit with hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and forced to fund a comprehensive, multi-decade cleanup of the entire region, supervised by a court-appointed trust. The victory was total. After the legal fees, a significant portion of Maeve's war chest was left. I used it to establish the O'Connell Preserve, putting the 40 acres into a protected trust forever. I used the rest to restore the cabin properly and to build a small research station where students and scientists could come to study the unique ecosystem of the swamp and monitor its recovery. Today, I'm sitting on the porch of that cabin. It doesn't sag anymore. The wood is sealed and strong, the tin roof is new. The swamp is quiet, but it's a healthy quiet now. The water in the creek runs clear. The land is healing. And so am I. I never wanted a fortune. I just wanted a home. I thought that meant 4 walls and a roof in a city somewhere. But I was wrong. Home isn't a place you buy. It's a place you belong. It's a place that holds your story. My inheritance wasn't 40 acres of swamp or a pile of cash. It was a purpose. It was the final, greatest gift from a grandmother who loved me enough to let me go and trusted me enough to find my way back. They laughed when I inherited a swamp, but what I found here wasn't just buried treasure, it was myself. This whole journey taught me that the most valuable things we inherit are rarely things you can put a price on. It's the stories, the strength, the sacrifices of those who came before us. It's the chance to finish a fight they started, to honor their legacy not just with words, but with action. What about you? What's the most important thing you've inherited that has nothing to do with money? It could be a recipe, a piece of advice, a stubborn streak, a sense of justice. Share it in the comments. I truly believe our legacies are the stories we carry and the choices we make because of them. Your story matters, and if you want to hear more stories about finding strength in unexpected places, about second chances and fighting for what's right, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that bell. You're not just a viewer here. You're part of a community of survivors, of fighters, of people who know that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the mud. Thank you for listening.